Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, we begin with two words that every student of the Civil War knows: unconditional surrender. It is perhaps the most memorable quote to emerge out of the Civil War. You know, these two words are credited to Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant as part of the surrender negotiations with his Confederate counterpart, Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner. You also know that Grant and Buckner had bonded before the war. They had come of age together as West Point classmates in the 1840s and junior officers during the Mexican War. Flash forward to February 16th, 1862. Grant's army has encircled the Confederate garrison of Fort Donelson. The Confederate commander, Gideon Pillow, and his subordinate, John B. Floyd, have refused to surrender. Pillow turns over command to Buckner, who opens negotiations with Grant. Grant's words, unconditional surrender, are part of the negotiations. In context, Grant wrote, quote, "No terms except an immediate and unconditional surrender can be accepted. I propose immediately to move upon your works," end quote. You might ask yourself, how did Grant come up with this wording? Did it spring from his own mind? Did he consult with his staff or talk to other subordinates? Well, according to a doctor who was present at Grant's headquarters, a man named John Hill Brinton, we have one explanation. Brinton's account can be found in his memoirs, which were published in 1914, some 50 years after the war and 7 years after his death. Dr. Brinton was a Union Army surgeon, and he noted in his memoirs that they were not alone in the headquarters. One of Grant's division commanders, pictured here, Brigadier General Charles Ferguson Smith, also played a part in those negotiations. Now, Smith was about 15 years older than Grant, and he was widely respected throughout the Army. Many, in fact, believed him one of the best commanders in the Union Army, including Grant, who is now his superior officer at Donelson. Smith looked every bit the soldier by 19th century standards. His whispering white mustache, ramrod straight posture, his gift for profanity and plain speaking really endeared him to his soldiers. Smith, of course, might have played a larger role in the war, but an accidental leg injury became infected and ended in his premature death just a couple of months after the surrender at Fort Donelson. Today, General Smith is all but forgotten. I want to read to you a relevant passage from Surgeon Brinton's memoirs. This passage begins on the brutally cold winter's night of February 15th to the 16th of 1862 in a modest cabin owned by the Crisp family, which is located about a mile from the Cumberland River and Fort Donelson, where General Buckner is ready to surrender. So, here we go. This is Surgeon Brinton in his memoirs. He says, "The night was inclement. Our troops slept on their arms, General C.F. Smith's division being absolutely within the lines of defense around Fort Donelson. All apparently passed quietly enough. No sorties were made by the enemy, and no attack by us. General Grant slept at his headquarters in a feather bed in the kitchen, and I remember that I was curled up on the floor near the fire with my head resting in the seat of my saddle. Early, very early, an orderly entered, ushering in General C.F. Smith, who seemed very cold, indeed, half frozen. He walked at once to the open fire on the hearth, for a moment warmed his feet, then turned his back to the fire, facing General Grant, who had slipped out of bed and who was quickly drawing on his outer clothes. "There's something for you to read, General Grant," said Smith, handing him a letter. And while he was doing so, Smith asked us for something to drink. My flask, the only liquor on the staff, was handed to him, and he helped himself in a soldier-like manner. I can almost see him now, erect, manly, every inch a soldier, standing in front of the fire, twisting his long white mustache and wiping his lips. Here's the letter that Buckner sent and that General Smith delivered to Grant. It's dated headquarters, Fort Donelson, February 16th, 1862, to Brigadier General U.S. Grant, commanding U.S. forces near Fort Donelson. Sir, in consideration of all the circumstances governing the present situation of affairs at this station, I propose to the commanding officer of the federal forces the appointment of commissioners to agree upon terms of capitulation of the forces and fort under my command, and in that view suggest an armistice until 12 o'clock today. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, S. B. Buckner, Brigadier General, CSA. The narrative by Surgeon Brinton continues. "What answer shall I send to this, General Smith?" asked Grant. "No terms to the damned rebels," replied Smith. Those were his actual words. General Grant gave a short laugh and, drawing a piece of paper, letter size and of rather poor quality, began to write. In a short time, certainly not many minutes, he finished and read aloud as if to General Smith, but really so that we understrappers could all hear. Understrappers is Brinton's reference to the officers who were wearing shoulder straps who were lower in rank. Here's the letter that Grant scratched out on that poor quality piece of paper. It's dated February 16th, 1862. General S. B. Buckner, Confederate Army. Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General. Brinton's narrative continues. General Smith gave a short, emphatic and remarking, "It's the same thing in smoother words," talking about his own comments earlier, stalked out of the room to deliver the letter, which was shortly followed by the return answer of surrender. Here's that letter. Headquarters, Dover, Tennessee, February 16th, 1862, to Brigadier General U.S. Grant, U.S. Army. Sir, the distribution of the forces under my command, incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose. I am, sir, your very obedient servant, S. B. Buckner, Brigadier General, CSA. Now Brinton wraps up his narrative, at least this passage. He writes, I recollect distinctly every feature of this visit of General Smith, his magnificent appearance, soldier-like bearing, and his abrupt mode of speech. The exposure of these nights must have told on him severely. He felt the cold and thrust out his feet and said, "See how the soles of my boots burned? I slept last night with my head in the saddle and with my feet too near the fire. I've scorched my boots." So there you have the backstory, an origin story, if you will, of unconditional surrender and the part played by Brigadier General Charles Ferguson Smith in making comments after Grant read the original letter from Buckner. Now, the tone of the formal letters that I interspersed in Brinton's narrative might leave you with an impression that when they finally met in person, which was later that day on February 16th, to finalize the surrender terms, it might have been testy, it might have been packed with tension, but in fact, the opposite was true. In truth, there were certainly the tensions of the moment. They could not be ignored. The surrender of 15,000 Confederates, the first standing army to be surrendered on the Confederate side, was about to take place. You can't ignore that. But the meeting opened with pleasantries that were softened by the pre-war shared connections between Buckner and Grant at West Point and in Mexico. In fact, it reminds me of a similar situation 3 years later at Appomattox, when Lee and Grant met at the court in the McLean House to enter in surrender negotiations. And of course, the pleasantries exchanged by the two generals remind me of what Buckner and Grant did here at Fort Donelson. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.